We were still upon the wall, right where you left us last time, listener. Joseph and I stood at the battlements again to once more look out over this fantastic world. Behind us, May and Flo made arrangements for the journey ahead. Because the Ariel's English was still minimal, they had reverted to the native language to speak more quickly. There was much to plan. We assumed they'd fill us in once the details were hammered out. In the meantime, my husband and I enjoyed the view for as long as we could. I can't get over the beauty of this place.
It's extraordinary.
And now we have to leave it.
But if we're successful, we can call this place home.
That's a big if. So we're off to the Lost Isles. How far is the archipelago from here?
According to the books, the Ariels can fly to the western coast in just a couple of days. But for the humans, by ground, it took twice that, maybe more. But then, they had the Midnight Lightning.
My husband perked up. He had somehow forgotten about the Pendergast marvel. For those who don't recall previous mentions of it in this podcast, the Midnight Lightning was a train, tank, submarine blend of a vehicle that Pendergast had used to explore this other world and which he was to eventually leave here. Joseph twisted and called for May, interrupting her talk with Flo, both of whom then came to quickly join us, hearing the urgency in his voice. He was just then asking to be shown the vessel when it occurred to him that Gentry and his household had likely taken it with them. From the books, Joseph knew that the man had been taught to operate the Marvel. Back on Earth, the Bard still functioned after all this time, so why not the Midnight Lightning? But as May then said, Gentry had not driven the vessel into exile, which meant that it was still here. Joseph, thrilled now, all but demanded to see it. Perceiving his excitement, May was reluctant to show him. She knew he was going to be disappointed. With a sigh, the winged woman leaned over the battlements and pointed down the mountainside, past the farmlands to the edge of the forest. She was directing our eyes to where the two met, to the tree line.
Where? I don't see it. Where is it?
It is there.
I don't see it either, May.
You don't see it, but it is there.
There was a long band of thickets that we mistook to be unchecked outgrowth from the adjacent woodland, but according to May, that was the Midnight Lightning. At this point, it was little more than a rusted husk, half sunk into the soil and overgrown entirely. Even through the autumn decay, which had greatly skeletonized the vegetation, we could not see any of the vessel. The brambles were just too dense. Remember, everything here grew wildly, primevally, but it may have also been our elevation, our distance from the thing. Whatever the case, it was clear to us that the Pendergast marvel was no longer marvelous. My husband balked, unable to comprehend how they could just let it be claimed by nature like that. To him, at least, the Midnight Lightning was something to be treasured, revered even. To the denizens of this other world, it was simply in the way. May went on to tell us that they had used the Midnight Lightning as temporary housing for the amalgam refugees back in the day. But when it came time to cultivate the fields for planting, they had moved the vessel and its severed parts off to the side. I asked what she meant by severed parts, but it was Joseph who answered me. He said the vessel had been heavily damaged, even broken apart, during a second battle for this realm, waged when Pendergast made his final voyage here. He and Gentry had fought the Atlanteans to defend this place, then fought their own kind yet again decades later, when the Cabal got hold of the orb and invaded this other planet, all of which we have discussed in previous seasons. Anyway, both battles were a victory for the good guys, but both had taken their toll on the Midnight Lightning. The Pendergast marvel had had its days of glory, but those were long done. It had not functioned in a generation, May added, and was of no use to anyone. Joseph ignored that and continued to gaze down the mountain intently. I knew my husband well. I knew where his thoughts had gone. If ever he got the chance, he would excavate the vessel, all by himself if necessary. Not because he thought the vehicle would be put into service again. No, he'd dig it out for the same reason people unearth fossils and relics. The history of it alone was worth the effort. Well, we won't be using that thing, it sounds like. So is our fellowship just gonna hoof it to Mordor, or what?
We will ride.
Ride?
Ride what? Ride what, May?
May?
This is the Endless Elsewhere podcast, Chapter 17, The Road Trip.
But first, we must equip ourselves for the journey ahead. To the armory.
May glided down to the courtyard, and Flo fluttered to it. Us humans? We used the latter. When reassembled, we followed our hostesses into a hollow section of the wall, a cloister of sorts, which housed the Strangel's armory. There were the expected racks of bladed implements and shelves of plated armor, but there, on a pedestal amidst the Dark Age arsenal, were a pair of futuristic weapons. It was Hardesty's zappers, the ray guns that Joseph and I had used against Heartland security, then brought here, only to have confiscated. May offered them back to us, but we declined, explaining that the power of each was depleted. Joseph briefly considered whether the solar charger we'd brought for the audio equipment could be used to power them, but he quickly abandoned the idea after looking one of the ray guns over. They had a bizarre design that obviously didn't function with commercial products. We couldn't just plug them in, is what I'm saying. We'd have to rewire the solar charger, a technical task for which neither one of us was qualified. We knew the attempt would be folly. We'd only succeed in breaking the solar charger and then have no way to power the other devices we'd brought. So the zappers remained where they were. And that was too bad. The ray guns would have proven a mighty advantage in this medieval world. However, my husband and I were not disheartened, as we were both more than just a little familiar with the Strangel's own style of weapons. May told us to take our pick. I began with a short sword. It was similar to my bygone Bacillard, but was lighter. Sharper, too, it looked. The blade was curved like a saber. It was not a steep bend, though. It still slid easily in and out of the accompanying scabbard. This was secured to a belt, but when I hung it around my waist, I found the arrangement uncomfortable and cumbersome. Looking about the armory, I found a harness with pouches that the Strangels wore across the chest. Their version of a bandolier, I think, but which I, as a wingless person, could wear in reverse. And I did so, but not until I had removed the scabbard from the belt and fastened it to the harness. I now carried the saber on my back. My reach is limited as I am rather short, but the weapon was also rather short, so much so that I could draw it from over my shoulder. A bonus feature of this modification was that I also now had some pouches available to me. One of these was positioned right at my clavicle, making it the perfect place to secure the field recorder. It even had a flap that would keep the device firmly in place while on the move, but also not hinder the microphone or the audio going into it. So now I didn't have to carry the thing around anymore. The only drawback was that the harness was tight, probably because I had to wear it over my jacket. Working my arms about, I began to worry that I wouldn't be able to break it in. I mean, I could, but it was going to take a while. The harness was exceptionally thick and durable, being of the same leathery material with which the Strangels made their boots and belts and so on. That's when it occurred to me that this could not be actual leather, since the natives kept no livestock. I asked May about this, and she explained that the textile was actually woven fibers, harvested from a species of tree. It was known for its resilience, so they used it to fabricate their hardier wares. So, plant leather. May told me about this as she and Flo conducted their own prep. Now done, both were draped in a thin coat of chainmail. Hauberks, Joseph called them later. Being the history buff that my husband is, he was my source of all this terminology. The Strangels wore this extra layer of protection over their gowns and leggings, the metal links cascading down to about the knee. For as burdensome as it may sound, the armor was light and did not seem to hinder the women whatsoever. The hauberks were backless and had crisscrossing straps that secured them in place around the wings of the women. May still had the dagger sheathed at her hip, but now she also held a spear. I had seen her select the same from Joseph's own armory back in Season 2, and now I knew why. This was her weapon of choice. It was apparently Flo's as well, who seemed to be in the tutelage of her friend the Amalgam, who'd been bred and trained for warfare. English wasn't the only thing May was helping Flo with. She was instructing her in combat, and likely had been even before their mission to Earth, as we had seen Flo and the other Strangels hold their own against Heartland security. Then I turned to my husband, who'd also finished outfitting himself, having taken more time than any of us. Unlike his wife, he had opted for one of the Strangels' thick belts, which gathered in his gambeson around the waist. From this hung a series of pouches not unlike those on my harness, just more plentiful and already filled with various supplies. It looked like Batman's utility belt, and my saying so only made him love it more. As I had with the short sword, Joseph had gone for what he knew. He wore gauntlets now. They were less bulky than his former pair, the armored gloves not being gloves at all, as they were not worn over his hands and forearms, but rather were strapped to them. They were open in the fingers so that his dexterity would not be hindered, but my husband had not stopped with the gauntlets. Joseph also wore a pair of matching greaves, as he called them, now buckled over his shins, and a pair of what he called pauldrons strapped over his shoulders. I remembered joking with him in a previous season that he would not be happy until we were in full suits of armor. It wasn't a joke for him. Looking good, babe.
Thanks. You too. Hey, you want some of this armor?
Nah, I want to stay nimble.
You sure?
Yeah, I'm good.
I had to stop your husband from armoring any further.
Yeah, I bet you did. Wait, why?
Too heavy.
What?
We must be mindful of the weight we put upon the manticores.
Upon the what? What are the... Did you say hardcores?
Manticores. That is Gentry's word for them.
This guy has a name for everything. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate the earthly frame of reference, but is that a real term?
Manticore. It's a chimera from mythology.
Huh?
Think big lion creature.
May, you guys have big lion creatures?
Oh, that's what we heard down in town, isn't it? In the stables.
Yes.
And why...
As you observed a moment ago, Lindsay, the Ariels keep no livestock, nor animals of any kind. This had also included those to be mounted for travel.
I guess there's no point when you can fly.
Indeed, but then I and the rest of the amalgams came here.
Those who cannot fly, those who needed something to ride for long journeys.
A concept they learned from Pendergast. He brought horses aboard the Midnight Lightning. His expedition used them to explore places in this world inaccessible by the vessel.
And I assume Gentry wanted a way to get around as well?
Quite so. He led a group of us to the Plains region where he'd witnessed animals while exploring our world. Animals he thought we may be able to subdue. Very difficult.
You were there too, Flo?
She was, as was Rhemigrayne and Zolanway.
The whole gang. Interesting. So you guys, what, wrangled up some of these hardcores and herded them back here?
Manticores, and yes. We then spent years domesticating and training them for our use.
But Gentry didn't mention these things in his manuscript, did he, Joseph?
Maybe. If he did so, it was only in passing. So I know about as much about these animals as you do.
Well, May, what are the hardcores like?
Manticores. For as fearsome and formidable as they are, we discovered them to be highly social and deeply intuitive creatures. They are sensitive to their riders. However, in order to be ridden, you will each have to form a bond with your own mount. They must trust you, but you must also trust them. We will begin the process at once as we depart for the western coast this very day.
Okay, let's get to it. I'm ready. Come on.
We must work quickly, yes, but carefully as well. The bond must be formed properly. Being humans, there is a possibility that they will not take to you at all.
And if they don't?
They will become defensive, even hostile. They could kill you.
Like I've been saying, hardcore. Our quartet left the armory for the courtyard, but here we parted company. May said that she would meet us at the bottom. Before another word could be spoken, she was up the ladder and surmounting the wall again. We watched as she leapt atop the battlements, spread her wings, then dropped over the side. I looked quizzically to Joseph, then to Flo. In her broken English, the Ariel told us that May, that all amalgams, did this when leaving the castle. I nodded, understanding. If you have only the power to glide, launching from the side of a mountain is probably as close to true flight as you will ever get. And it sounded like the hybrid people seldom missed the opportunity to do so. But for the Ariels, flight was commonplace. So Flo was happy to remain grounded with us humans. Besides, we were still visitors. Trespassers to some, who required a native escort. We disappeared into the floor of the courtyard, descending the staircase into the crypt below the castle. On some undeniable impulse, my husband broke away from us and made a determined march toward the Pendergast tomb. The guards there stepped forward to confront him. He only wished to pay his respects, and Flo told them as much when she flitted to his side in a strong gust of wind that tossed my hair in my face. Moving this aside, I then went to join them. Well, to join Flo. She stood a couple of steps back from Joseph, letting him have a moment alone at the grave of a legend. I stood beside the Ariel, glancing at her. Earlier, I had told May not to thank Flo for her intervention with Bruce, not until we knew what she had proposed. Even though a quest sounded like a lot of trouble, Flo had, in fact, saved us, spared us banishment. So I owed her some gratitude now. Being in this venerated place, I kept my voice low, respectful. Thank you for what you did back there with the Keeper.
You are well.
Oh, it's welcome. You are welcome.
Home for you soon.
Sweetheart, I sure hope so. Joseph was taking longer than a moment at the tomb, so I had a look around the cavern, surprised when I spotted Remy. Earlier, after being assigned to our mission, he'd flounced angrily down here. To sulk, no doubt. Only then, seeing him again, did it dawn on me that the awaiting quest had reassembled our group from Season 2. We were to be the same mismatched band again. What were the odds that circumstances would make us companions once more? Joseph and I were going on the quest to earn our place here. May was going for absolution for her crimes. Flo, demonstrating her profound character, had actually volunteered. And Remy had been conscripted. Even still, we'd be together again. All of us. Well, not quite all of us. Then I realized that Remy hadn't come into the cavern to brood. He was doing what Joseph was doing, visiting a grave. The Ariel stood at the wall to our right with his back to us, gazing up at one of the countless sepulchres carved into the rock. It had to be that of his friend, the other stranger who had come with them to Earth and returned with a sickness that took his life and the lives of others. I thought back to the Season 2 finale, the title of which I'd borrowed from the H.G. Wells classic War of the Worlds. Obviously, I had chosen it for different reasons, but in the story, extraterrestrials are killed by an earthly contagion. Flo saw where my eyes had gone and leaned over, reminding me of the Ariel's name.
Zolinway.
Remy had not heard his former friend whispering to me earlier, but now he did. It was the name of their dead companion that reached him from across the cavern. The Ariel turned and scowled. At me, of course, but also at Flo. Maybe more so at her. Not only was she in the company of the enemy, but because of her, he would be as well. Had Flo not intervened at our trial, there would be no quest. Remy was visibly upset and became increasingly so. He very well may have come over to bark at us had we not just then left ourselves. Joseph finishing at the tomb of Pendergast. The three of us departed the crypt for the long corridor that cut through the mountain, eventually appearing at the foot of it to an awaiting May. She asked what had delayed us. The dead, Flo answered. Handing off escort duties to the amalgam, the Ariel then fluttered away. She was off to see to the preparations they had been discussing atop the wall not long ago. When Flo was gone, the three of us sidled down the slope, rounded the band of dead soil, and re-entered the town. By now, reports of the Keeper's decision had spread to the whole populace, so everyone knew where we were going. They cleared a path for us to the stables. Inside was a row of sizable enclosures. Stalls. Joseph and I gave these little more than a glimpse. Not only were they empty, but we could now see that the stables opened onto a large paddock that projected from the side of the town. There, in the stockade, looming massively before us were... I didn't even know what I was looking at. And that's how I knew these were the manticores. There were 3 of them. The animals were expectedly quadrupedal, but unexpectedly tall. Taller even than the horses who had inspired their use. The shape and contouring of each was reptilian, but the flesh and fur, mammalian. It was like the hides of beasts had been stretched over the skeletons of dragons. The coats of all 3 were some mixture of gray and brown. Roan, their coloring might have been called. The hair was thick all over, but was at its most dense around the head, forming a proper mane from which sprouted not only a pair of floppy ears, but a pair of spiraling horns. Similar bones projected from elsewhere in the creatures. Talons curved from their paws, and tusks jutted from their snouts. Even though they faced us, we could still see long, thin, and very expressive tails flicking about at the other end of the creatures. May had warned us of the ferocity, of the formidability of these animals, but no foreknowledge would have prepared me for this first look at them. I felt my heart sink in their presence. But I was weirdly comforted when I, at last, took in what was perhaps their most unique, most surprising feature, their eyes. These were far larger than they would have been on an earthly animal of comparable size. The manticores were not stereoscopic, they were lateral-eyed, which is a fancy, nerdy Joseph way of saying that these huge eyes were on either side of their heads. I don't know by what phenomenon you can see intelligence in eyes, but that's what I saw in theirs. Gentleness, too. Even still, May had expressed her concern for how the manticores would react to us. We were more than just strangers, my husband and I. We were off-worlders. Imagine a horse's reaction to an alien trying to mount it back on Earth. That was our situation here. Joseph asked why there were only 3 of them. May explained. Not only was it a strain on their resources to keep such enormous animals fed, but the simple truth is that the manticores were not often required. They were intended for use by the amalgams, but the hybrid people rarely traveled now, not since Gentry was sent away. That's how afraid they had become of losing their place here. The amalgams didn't even feel safe leaving it. Perhaps they feared venturing out, only to return and discover that they had been evicted, that this was no longer their home. The cadre had successfully ousted the human. The half-humans were next. And they knew it. I hadn't noticed the approach of the aerial stable hands, not until they flew suddenly over us into the paddock. They were burdening what I did not immediately recognize to be saddles, not until they laid these across the backs of the manticores, then landed to strap them into place. As the stable hands worked, Joseph remarked to May about the peculiar design of the saddles. I looked closer to see what he meant. Having seen their various crafts, I could plainly tell that these had not been fashioned by the Strangels. In fact, the very substance of the saddles was not available in this part of the world. They were scaled and encrusted with bizarre seashells. They looked aquatic. That term took me back to a previous conversation about another race of people with whom the Strangels shared this planet. May told us that the aquatics had gifted these to their allies. Being humanoid, the aquatic saddles could also be used by the land dwellers, which now included my husband and I. Whereas the people of the air had never ridden animals until recently, the people of the water had long tamed all manner of oceanic life. Pulling from his knowledge of the manuscripts, Joseph described shark and whale-like sea creatures that the aquatics rode beneath the waves. As he told me about this, the stable hands fetched bridles and reins, attaching these to the manticores, then receding from the paddock. The animals were now ready. But me? Not so much.
Let us begin.
All right, here we go.
Are you seriously not afraid of them?
No, why? Are you?
Yeah. Look at them. I'm a fun-sized snack to these things.
They are not carnivorous, Lindsay.
See? Plant eaters. The manticores are herbivores.
Manti-herbivores. Yeah, I got it. But you also said they could kill us, May.
Yes, that is true. But should they kill you, the manticores will not then consume your flesh.
Oh, great. That makes me feel so much better. Thanks.
Are you ready now?
Yes, ma'am.
Still a no for me.
Very well. As you prepare yourself, I shall demonstrate the proper technique to mount and dismount. Observe.
May leapt over the fence and strode confidently into the paddock. None of the manticores reacted to her approach. They remained calm because they knew the amalgam, because they trusted her and she them, which was apparently of the utmost importance. One of the tall things even crouched down so that she could slip a boot into a stirrup, then sling herself into the saddle upon its back. She set a hand on the neck of the manticore and spoke softly to it before taking up the reins. With a light tug of these, the animal rose back up and at her direction moved about the stockade. These creatures do not gallop and trot. They lope and lunge. They will even pounce if so instructed by their rider. They were fast, yes, but also incredibly versatile. They could undoubtedly move over any terrain, even climb, with their rider still in place. May seemed to forget her demonstration and did some trick riding instead. I'd call it showing off if I didn't think better of the woman. She ran her manticore to its top speed, circling the other two. She lifted into a crouch upon the saddle as her mount whirled dizzyingly around the paddock. Then, at her command, the creature came to an immediate halt, fastening its claws into the dirt and bucking the amalgam with tremendous force. May rocketed into the sky. She soared in a great arc, at the zenith of which the woman thrust out her wings to catch the air. She then came spiraling gracefully back down, alighting upon her animal again without so much as a hair out of place. Joseph clapped. I rolled my eyes. Okay, that was a bit much.
Come now.
Joseph hopped the fence as if he'd been waiting to his whole dang life. He would have run to the manticores if not for me. He paused and waited, even helped me over the fence like the gentleman he always was. Then the pair of us went forward together. Nervous as I was, I took his hand as we went. The manticores began to snort and shift about uneasily as we neared.
Stop there, my friends. You must come no closer until they have given you permission.
Permission?
What do we do, Maevalesse?
You must name them. This will begin your bond.
Name them? Don't they already have names?
They have many, yes. But as its rider, you must choose a name by which your mount will be known to you specifically.
What do you call yours?
My mount is Gootslandir.
I'm gonna call him Guts.
You're giving the animals nicknames now, too?
Yeah, awesome nicknames. What are you gonna call yours? I assume that one there is for you.
Maevalesse, is my manticore male or female?
Yours is a mare. Lindsay, yours is a stallion.
Let's see. I will call her Lamray, after the legendary horse of King Arthur.
Very good. Lindsay?
I will call him Jellybean, after a hamster I had as a kid. Whoa.
Okay, easy.
What's wrong with them?
I think I startled them.
May?
This is good, my friends. The manticores respond well to laughter, as they understand the meaning of the sound. See how she inclines her head. Joseph, make your approach. Lamre is inviting you forward.
Joseph went to the manticore, slowly extending his hand to run over her neck. At his touch, the animal crouched down to the ground, allowing him to mount. His height enabled him to do so with relative ease. Once he'd taken up the reins, Lamre, as I guess I have to call her now, rose back up. My husband was beaming with joy.
Oh, Lindsay, you gotta try this.
I looked from Joseph to Lamre, then to my own manticore, Jellybean.
Ha. You cannot fool them, Lindsay. Speak true to your mount. He must get a sense of you.
Okay. Hi there. Easy there. Oi. Is this because I named you Jellybean? It's not that bad of a name. I loved that hamster. He was my best friend. My only friend, really. When I was young, we moved around a lot, so it was hard to make friends, you know? Harder still to keep them. But Jellybean, good old JB, he was always there waiting for me when I got home from school. I just loved him so much.
Lindsay.
Oh, yeah, okay. I inched forward, and as I did, Jellybean crouched down, letting me climb aboard. My lofty husband and agile friend didn't have any trouble mounting their animals, but for a shorty like me, well, it took a bit more effort. I was able to get myself into the saddle without any help, though. With all of us mounted now, our training could begin. I assumed this would be the hard part, but as it turns out, once the trust bond is established, the rest was pretty simple. It was mostly a matter of learning how the manticores moved. We started with the basics, striding in slow circles around the paddock, Joseph following May and I him. Fortunately, Guts, Lamre, and Jellybean were already a close group before Joseph and I came along. The animals knew how to move together as a unit, even with their inexperienced riders. As we worked, May expressed her surprise, but also her satisfaction that the animals had taken to us so quickly, especially considering our humanness. The amalgam told us to take it as a compliment. We had good hearts, and the manticores knew it. Then, with barely the rudiments down, it was time to go. I tried to convince May that we needed more practice. Even Joseph, as gung-ho as he was about all this, echoed me. May fully agreed with us both, but said we didn't have the time. The Keeper had agreed to send us on our mission as an alternative to banishment. This was a mercy that pacified some, but the part of the agreement that pacified the cadre was that we leave immediately. I didn't realize just how immediately until I tried to dismount, and May commanded me to stay in place. Now that we were atop the manticores, we could not get down. Not one of us was allowed to set foot upon this territory again until we'd return from our quest with our task completed. And I thought these animals were hardcore. This also meant that we wouldn't be able to return to the cabin before we departed. Joseph asked me if that would be a problem. He knew I'd brought the field recorder, but not that I'd also stuffed 2 extra batteries into my pockets. As long as I was conservative in its use, we should have enough power to document our adventure. It was better to leave the rest of it behind anyway. The solar charger, the laptop, everything in the backpack. It would be safer in the cabin. May then nodded to the stable hands and they flew into the paddock again. Whereas before they'd been carrying saddles, now they carried saddle bags. They commenced to strap these in place upon our animals. These were our supplies, May said. The provisions and gear were donations from the townsfolk, who'd assembled it at the behest of Flo. That's what the Ariel had gone off to do. Once the stable hands finished their work, they flitted from our manticores to the farthest edge of the stockade and moved a portion of the fence aside. What I had not realized was also a gate. May nudged Guts forward. Joseph and I did the same with Lamre and Jellybean, following her from the paddock and the town itself. The manticores carried us past the farmland to the forest and through the same tree tunnel we'd used to get here from the savannah. As we rode, Joseph asked May about something he knew from the books. A lake that was off in these woods somewhere. This body of water had an islet at its center, and upon this, a ziggurat. He told me later that this stair-step pyramid was of Atlantean making, constructed ages ago, back when the ancient humans had befriended the Ariels and been allowed to build within their domain. May explained that the ziggurat was not unlike the Midnight Lightning now, reclaimed by nature so thoroughly that nothing of the original structure could be seen. Joseph seemed satisfied with that answer. Whereas he'd been horrified to learn that Pendergast's marvel was all overgrown, this pyramid apparently deserved to be forgotten. When we left the forest for the savannah, we found Flo and Remy waiting in the tall grass, having just flown here ahead of us. Remy appeared to have visited the armory after we had. He was now sporadically armored and clutched some kind of war hammer, a cleated mace. As I then learned, the two Ariels would fly as we rode. This was Remy's preference. The mounting of animals was a human tradition and a selfish one. It meant taking a creature from its natural habitat and forcing it into servitude. This practice was an abomination, according to Remy and the cadre. Flo could have easily ridden with one of us, the saddles being long enough to seat two, but she had chosen to fly as well. Probably to keep an eye on Remy. He needed watched. At the very least, he was a spy. At the most, a saboteur. But having two of our companions above us would prove advantageous, May observed. The Ariels would be our lookouts and scouts, as the pair could fly ahead and survey the awaiting terrain. Our quartet was now a reluctant quintet. 2 Ariels, 2 humans, and our leader, who was equally both. May knew the way to the western coast, off of which lay the archipelago. She knew the way because she'd made the journey before. Remember, she was born and raised on the Lost Isles. For her, this would be a homecoming of sorts. I wondered how she felt about that, about returning to the place where she and a whole generation of amalgams had been abandoned, orphaned. I could not read her face, though. She was ever the bastion of strength, even as she gave the command to proceed. And so off we set, beginning our adventure across an alien world to confront an unknown evil, what would have been a seminal moment, had I not ruined it.
Ride like the wind, jelly bean!
Joseph had said that, according to the books, it was a 2-day flight from the castle to the coast, and twice that or more in the Midnight Lightning, so I couldn't even guess how long it would take us to get there by Manticore. May wasn't sure either. No one had ever actually ridden these animals to the western edge before. The Strangels had been relying on the Ariels to soar there and back again, but as May had told us, no fresh report had been delivered in what was a worrisome amount of time. Recall, the Strangels had set up a guard presence along the shore of the mainland to watch the archipelago for any sign of the Atlanteans who'd been seen returning to the ruins of their former civilization. Well, a boat of some kind was spotted coming in from across the sea and was seen by the aquatics from the water. They didn't even know if anyone was actually aboard, and there didn't seem to be based on the fact that the vessel then ran aground on one of the islands. For all we knew, it was just a ghost ship. But Joseph and I, from previous experience, knew that even ghost ships should be taken seriously. The manticores, despite their size, had a nimble grace to them. Of all their many fine characteristics, I may have appreciated this one best. There was no jolting or jouncing as there would have been had we sat atop horses. This also meant we wouldn't have to worry about saddle sores, so that was nice. I noticed that we were heading back the way we had initially come more than a week ago, so as the creatures stalked swiftly across the savannah, I was scanning for that portion of it where we'd first come to this other world, and soon I spotted it. There was no missing the large section of grass that had been trampled or blown into swirls. Without the Strangel army or the intergalactic doorway, it was just a field again, of interest only to me. It marked the farthest we'd ever been this way. Everything beyond this spot was something new. Something unknown. As we rode, I began wishing for a scarf. The cool breeze was made a cold wind by the rapid pace of the manticores. So, when we eventually paused to let our animals rest, I used the time to warm up. Flo and Remy alighted from the air just as the rest of us dismounted. My fellow riders and I had not been off of the animals since first bestriding them back in the paddock. It had been a strange experience, getting atop them for the first time. Now it felt strange to be off the animals. Free of their burdens, the manticores commenced to graze. We didn't have to worry about them wandering off. They would remain close by. Even still, I kept an eye on them and watched as they quickly laid bare the area around us. Had we needed to pack food for our mounts, we would not have gotten very far. They were enormous, and so were their appetites. Fortunately, this world was plentiful. Even with the vegetation browning and dying with the season, they still partook of the grass or whatever shrubbery was about. I gawked in fascination as they defoliated a nearby bush in seconds. While there was no need to pack food for the animals, our expedition had brought their dessert. We would be treating them to apples, of which we'd had about a bushel's worth packed for us by the townspeople. They loved this earthly fruit as our own horses do. Taking 3 from a saddlebag, May tossed the first to Joseph, the second to me. We looked on as she offered the third to Guts, who leapt at her, plucking it from her hand with enthusiasm, but also with delicacy. The huge animal could have easily bitten off half of her arm, but he took care to gobble up only the fruit. This startled me terribly, so I let my husband go next. He held out the apple to Lamre. She came back to her rider equally as excited as Guts had to May. With a single swipe of her tongue, Lamre lapped the whole thing into her mouth. Joseph grimaced at his now saliva-slathered hand, then went to clean it off. Jellybean turned and looked to me expectantly, like some child wanting candy. I was still too afraid to hand-feed the manticore, and when it started toward me, I panicked and tossed the apple at him. My suddenly surging adrenaline sent the piece of fruit far higher into the air than intended, above the head of the huge animal. The manticore then leapt from the ground, catching it perfectly from the air as if we'd been rehearsing this all day. He landed with a reverberating thud. Well, that was something. So, are we making camp here?
No, we have plenty of daylight ahead of us.
Really? Long day.
Oh, I thought you had noticed by now, sweetheart. The days are longer here. Of course, without clocks and cell phones, it's easy to lose track of the time, huh?
Joseph had retrieved a rag from one of his saddlebags and was wiping his hand off as he came back to join us.
We're used to about 12 hours of day and 12 of night, but here it's closer to 14 of each. I imagine it fluctuates with the seasons as it does on Earth, but yeah, even in the autumn of this world, the days will still be long.
Wow. So yet another detail you just glossed right over when we talked about this place.
And how many times did I tell you just to read the books?
I'm just teasing you. But I think we have digital versions of them on the laptop.
Really? Okay, well, that's good to know.
So, what did they pack us to eat? May? May tossed me another apple. This one was for me, and I had to eat it quickly as Jellybean was eyeing it. After we'd all had a snack, it was time to get back on the road, so to speak. I noticed a subtle alteration in the topography. I rode alongside May and asked about it. She said we were entering the plains region, from which the manticores had originally been rustled. She wasn't the only one having an awkward homecoming on this trip. Even though this was their territory, we never saw any wild manticores, which was apparently a good thing. May said they would react badly to the sight of us riding their own kind. May had told us that Gentry led a party of amalgams and aerials to this region to round up these animals, an expedition that had included May, Flo, Remy, and their now departed friend. I wondered if it was then that Gentry had recognized the strength of these friends, and that's why he would later select the 4 of them for the mission to Earth. But as we've thoroughly covered, it was the mission to Earth that had fractured not only this friend group, but their entire community as well. I wondered what emotions being here again were conjuring up in my companions. I looked to May, trying to glean her feelings. As ever, there was no getting past her austerity, so I gave my attention back to the world around me. We were on safari in the alien wilderness, so while we spotted no other manticores, we did see other animals. Well, briefly. A waterhole soon appeared in the distance, rimmed by thirsty creatures of all descriptions. Descriptions I would have related to you, listener, had I been given the proper time to study them. As it was, Remy flew over the waterhole and frightened them all from it. The menagerie fled away from us. I was very annoyed at him, thinking he'd done this just to be a jerk, but this was not so. May nodded her gratitude to him, then led us over to the waterhole so that our own animals could have a much-needed drink before the final stretch of the day. Once the manticore's thirst was, at last, slaked, we began again, our mounts all but bounding now, hydrated and reinvigorated as they were. Because of this, we covered a substantial amount of ground. The animals could have continued this new, faster pace had the sun not finally gone into decline, and the temperature with it. We looked for a good spot to camp for the night, finding such near a rock formation. This jagged outcropping didn't offer any shelter, just a wall to put our backs to, which, out here, was better than nothing. We dismounted for the second time that day, but the aerials did not alight, not just yet. Looking skyward to where the twin moons were already pushing themselves into view, I spotted Flo and Remy hovering high above on beating wings. They were looking this way and that, inspecting the area. Not until they were satisfied that we were at least relatively safe did they join us on the ground. The Ariels then set about making camp as May taught Joseph and I how to remove the saddles and bridles from our animals, unburdening the manticores of more than just our weight. This accomplished, our mounts set about grazing as they had before. We flopped the saddles into the grass, then took from them our supplies. There were rations, of course, but bedrolls and blankets as well. The Strangels, those who donated to our quest, had not neglected a single provision. We partook of the food, then the 5 of us prepared our own sleeping area, the manticores doing the very same. When they'd had their fill, the enormous animals returned to our little bivouac and lay themselves down in a loose triangle, enclosing us between their bodies. The manticores would sleep as a wall between us and any potential danger. I assumed they had been taught to be this defensive of their riders, but May told me it was in their nature to be. I appreciated that, as much as I appreciated their body heat, which radiated over us. This, plus the fire we'd built, would ensure that we remained nice and toasty all night long. Plus, I had my husband to snuggle up against, which is probably why I was the first one out. I woke suddenly and unaccountably in the middle of the night, however. I couldn't even guess how long I had been asleep, or what time it was. Not that it even mattered here. The people of this world didn't track time with the obsessive specificity that we did on Earth. It was simply late. That would have been the answer had I asked, but no one was even awake to question. Then I wondered why I was awake. Maybe because I'd grown accustomed to being swayed gently to sleep in our hanging bed back at the cabin, for which the stationary bedroll was a poor substitute. Maybe it was because I didn't feel entirely safe out here in the open, in this alien backcountry. Or maybe it was knowing that one in our group could be plotting against us. I looked across the dwindled fire to where Remy lay. He slept as the other Strangels did, upon his belly with his wings steepled on his back. In that bleary moment of fresh consciousness, I thought I heard him mumbling to himself, and I bristled, alarmed. I sat up and turned on the field recorder, but then Flo lifted her head. It had been her whispering. She smiled.
What are you doing?
I pray. Cannot sleep, so I pray.
Oh, okay. Like, for protection, or?
Forgiveness.
Forgiveness for what?
Coward. I coward.
What?
It took me a minute, sleepy as I was, but I then remembered what May had told us about Flo, about her fleeing the castle after the death of their friend and the ensuing epidemic. May had said this Ariel had avoided infection by doing so, both of the virus and the hatred it ignited among their people afterward.
Sonnenway die, and I flee. Others need help, and I flee, afraid.
I think you're being too hard on yourself, Flo. May said lots of people left temporarily during the outbreak. There's no shame in that.
She not leave, not Maevalesse. She stay. She help sick. Maevalesse brave, not like me.
That's why you've stuck by her side since coming back. You want to be like her. Training with the spear, speaking my language. These are things Maevalesse can teach you.
Cannot be taught. Courage.
It took courage to go to the Keeper. You likely saved my life and my husband's. Besides, don't try to be May. She's strong, yes, but, cold. You are not. So, be yourself, Flo.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good friend. You are needed here.
On the expedition?
On my world. You help us. Need help. Light dimming now.
In my hazy state, I thought she meant the fire and offered to stoke it, but that wasn't the light she was talking about. She had tears in her eyes now. To hide these from me, Flo then lay her head back down. Whether she went to sleep or not, she was done talking. May had said that the people of this world were in spiritual crisis. They had once lived in harmony with one they called the Maker, but something had happened. Something had changed. The cadre thought it was their interactions with humans. Maybe they were right. As ugly as their prejudice was, perhaps they had good reason to separate themselves from all things human. I didn't know much about their alien theology. but I was reminded of something Grendel said just before we left Earth, when he'd evolved his power to possess bodies at will. He'd said that every person contained the capacity for two spirits, their own and another. It was by occupying this other void that he, like the demons he apparently emulated, took control of people. But the traveler had also said that he occasionally encountered someone with an indwelling, he called it, a spirit of another kind already occupying the second space. Grendel said he couldn't even approach people like this, that the presence was powerful and repelled him even from afar. Grendel didn't understand it, and he feared it. Is that what the Strangels called the Maker? Was this their god? The god? Was this the same presence? And was it everywhere in the universe? Joseph stirred, pulling me against him. He would never remember doing so, but he caressed my hair until I was asleep again. Thankfully, I didn't wake until the next morning. I did so to the sound of the manticores standing, stretching, and yawning. I did each of those myself, then asked about breakfast. May tossed me an apple again. I couldn't help but be a little disappointed. Even the best-tasting apples aren't good for every meal. Remy was just then stepping past me, returning his bedroll and blanket to the saddlebags. I offered the apple to him. Was I testing the waters? Extending an olive branch? Probably neither, honestly. I'd just woken up and wasn't thinking clearly, but I had apparently activated my superpower. You know, the one that can get literally anyone to talk to me. And it worked, but not in the way I would have liked. Remy pushed the apple and my hand away as he erupted in an angry rant. Whoa, you kissed your mother with that mouth, dude? Look, Remy, you know I don't speak Elvish or whatever, so just stop.
I hate your food and hate your language. Taste of both like rot in my mouth.
Okay, take a bow, drama queen. I only then felt Joseph at my back. He'd materialized there as soon as the outburst started. Jellybean had also reacted to Remy's harsh voice by raising his hackles. The manticore didn't know what was happening exactly, but he understood the tone of anger in the Ariel's voice. It was May who took control of the situation. She stepped between us, then escorted Remy away from me. I waited for him to glance back. Then I took an exaggerated bite from the apple. Delicious earth food. It's literally the best food on any planet anywhere.
All right, sweetheart, just let it go, let it go.
Well, he made me mad.
I know he did.
You okay? Headache still there?
It's gotta stop at some point, right?
I figured you would have gotten over the withdrawals by now. I did days ago.
I drank a pot a day for years, then went cold turkey. It stands to reason that it takes a while for me to adjust. I love it here, but...
You miss coffee.
Especially in the mornings.
I finished my apple as the others got something to eat. Afterward, we set about breaking camp. We resaddled the manticores, then returned all the bedding and other supplies to them, lastly throwing our own weight on their backs. With May at the lead, we rode off across the grassy terrain as the Ariels took to the sky. I regarded the two of them soaring overhead, giving the pair more attention today than I had yesterday. I probably did so because of my conversation with Flo last night, or my argument with Remy this morning, or both. But as I watched them, my eyes were drawn suddenly beyond the Ariels, above them. A flock of birds, having just emerged from some cloud cover, could now be seen traversing the heavens in a loose formation. I could not discern much of the avians. I could only see enough to say that they were exotic and exaggerated in their design. I then wondered if there was ever any mid-air collisions or disputes between the birds of this world and the Ariels. I was so curious, I called this question out to my husband, assuming he might know from the books and not wanting to distract May from her navigations. Joseph tugged his reins to the side, veering himself and Lamre over to me and Jellybean so that he would not have to shout his reply. As we rode parallel, he told me that the Ariels maintained a perfect balance with the natural world, and this included airspace, which they had divided into strata. They were the lowest flying of all flighted creatures on this world, leaving the birds to the loftier altitudes, and neither ever climbing too high. The lower temperatures and thinning oxygen of the upper atmosphere kept them all away. The avians knew this by instinct, and the Ariels by intellect, but the winged people refrained for more than just this reason. They regarded the higher echelon of the sky to be an ethereal realm and the dominion of the Maker. As Joseph told me this, I thought of their mountain and its peak that reached this forbidden height and dwelt among the clouds. I kept thinking about that mountaintop as we rode, and I had a lot of time to do so. It was a long stretch we covered, the longest yet. Our expedition had journeyed for what felt like half the day, but was probably less. I was still getting used to this world's time. Finally, we came to our first stop since setting out. I thought it was to rest and feed our animals, but when May did not dismount, I knew we'd been interrupted by something else. Joseph and I exchanged glances, then rode forward, coming along either side of her. May's lighted eyes were surveying. The landscape before us was more of the same as what lay behind. Joseph asked what she was looking for. A landmark, she said. Something she knew to be ahead of us, something to navigate by. May was becoming cagey and pretended not to hear me when I asked what it was, offering to help look for it. Noticing that we'd stopped, Flo and Remy descended but did not alight, instead remaining aloft on their beating wings. They spoke in their native language, first to each other and then to May, who replied. Flo pointed ahead, knowing what the amalgam was looking for, having seen it. I noticed that Remy made a face of confusion. Despite sharing the same vantage, he had not seen whatever it was they were talking about. Even still, the aerials flew ahead of us and we followed Flo to the landmark. May barely acknowledged it and tried to move on immediately, but the interest of her group had already been captured. She alone remained upon her animal. Joseph and I dismounted as the aerials landed, the four of us going forward together.
We should move on.
Oh, wow, look at this.
What is this? May?
Ask your husband. He seems to know.
It's a dirigible, an airship. It was, anyway, about 100 years ago.
I tilted my head and squinted, trying to imagine the design of the craft from the wreckage before me. It was not unlike picturing an animal you've never seen based solely on the bone fragments. So, near impossible. At least with the moment I gave it before relenting.
This was one of 2 escort vessels, wasn't it, Maevalesse? For the flagship?
That is correct.
What are we talking about, Joseph?
This craft, it's from the battle for Airy Castle, the first one, when the Nephilim and the Atlantean armies besieged the mountain. Gentry recorded that 2 escort vessels came with a flagship that was full of amalgam warriors, that is, the first generation of them. They were saved for last because they were the best the enemy had. The flagship flew over the castle and they deployed from it. This is when Gentry entered the temple, like we talked about previously, Lindsay. It was actually an amalgam who had gotten inside, trying to reach the lipid font.
I looked to May as Joseph spoke, but she had already turned away. I now understood why she didn't want to linger here, why she didn't want to dredge up the past. To do so was to reiterate that amalgams were bred to be the enemy. Unfortunately, my husband, excited as he was to recount the history of this world, kept at it.
Joseph, maybe we should move on.
After his experience in the temple, Gentry and the Aerials turned the tide. They took the fight to the flagship, sabotaging it, crashing it into the side of the mountain where it rolled down into the river.
Wait, the river? Like where our cabin is?
They would have dismantled it and carried away every last piece. You see, the Aerials have an intolerance for Atlantean technology.
Human technology.
Hey, pal, I thought English was like rot in your mouth.
Remy hushed up after that, but he'd already accomplished what he wanted with the comment, and with the glance he tossed to the field recorder in my shoulder harness. He had highlighted a belief of the cadre, but also what was an older belief of the Aerials, a belief that technology, not unlike, say, magic, was a perverse form of power, true power coming from the Maker alone. I was to later see firsthand that the Aerials had destroyed all devices recovered from the enemy. What sounds like an ignorant, primitive response, I know. But Atlantean technology was in actuality Nephilim technology, born of the giants' evil minds. So maybe it was for the best that the winged people had done away with what they'd found after the battle, an account of which Joseph was still giving.
Seeing their flagship go down, its 2 escort vessels retreated, going back to the Lost Isles. I guess one of them never made it.
But the other did make it and reported the defeat. The war was over, and so there was no need for the next generation of amalgams.
We all looked up to May as she spoke, but her head was still turned away. If she was having an emotion, she was hiding it from us. May was a child during the battle Joseph was describing, a child that was to be discarded as dispassionately as unspent ammunition, because that's all she and the others were now, unfired cannon fodder. I know my husband. I know he wanted to go forward, to inspect and touch the rusted bones of the 100-year-old wreckage, but he did not. For May's sake, he refrained. Until now, he'd not noticed the effect this downed airship, or his own words, were having on the amalgam. He'd been lecturing about what he'd read, forgetting that it was an exciting story for him, but a dark history for someone else. I saw the sting of guilt in my husband's eyes as he remounted Lamre and nodded for me to do the same. He knew an apology would only make it worse, so instead he called for May to lead on. Still looking away, she nodded and started forward without a word. The manticores were, and had been, in need of a break, but not until we were some distance from the dirigible did May let us stop again. After they'd eaten and rested, we began the second leg of the day's journey. Does riding an alien animal across an alien landscape with alien companions ever get boring? No, it really does not. But I also realize that you, listener, have heard it described at least a couple of times already, so you get it. This will not be the last time that I do so, but I'm going to jump forward just a bit to that night, when I again woke suddenly and found Flo whispering. I asked if she was praying. She smiled, telling me that she was practicing the Defender's tongue. What better practice is there than to speak with someone who knows the language? So we chatted quietly across the fire as we had last night, but for much longer. We'd taken a shine to each other, the Ariel and I. Our friendship had blossomed quickly, organically, unlike, I had to admit, my friendship with May. It was just easier with Flo. The Ariel was fun, even funny, whereas the amalgam was guarded and laconic. I didn't record our conversation, trying to conserve battery power as I was. Besides, I didn't expect anything too weighty to be discussed. But as it turned out, we did end up on a rather heavy topic. Our conversation eventually drifted back to our aforementioned leader, to May. I asked Flo about the amalgam, all the more curious about her past, of which I had been given a peek earlier today. Aside from her childhood on the Lost Isles, all I really knew about May was her loyalty to Jonas Gentry. I had assumed that he must be a father figure to May, who'd never had such. And since I knew Gentry had his own amalgam children with his Ariel wife, this made perfect sense. But when I casually voiced this assumption, Flo quieted down. I had to prompt her. The Ariel spoke, but not before looking to May to confirm that she was still asleep. Flo then rather reluctantly, and in a voice lower than even our whispers, implied that May's relationship with the older, married Gentry was not what I had thought. It was something else entirely. She also suggested that this was how May had been made leader of the mission to Earth, not to mention the other prominence she had garnered on this world beforehand, prominence afforded her by Gentry. Flo told me that May had been eager to go with him into exile, but he'd left her behind. That much I knew already, but now saw it in a new light. This sickened me. I'd never met the legendary Jonas Gentry, just heard the stories of this great man who my husband and many here regarded as a hero, but I did know May. I hated it, but I had to look at her differently now. She was altered in my view, diminished. I did not willfully keep this revelation from my husband. I very much wished to speak with Joseph about it, but never got the chance as we were in the constant company of others. So it was a weight that I had to carry alone, and it was a heavy one. People make mistakes, certainly. But this? Or maybe the mistake was Flo's. Maybe this was just a baseless rumor. Or maybe the mistake was mine. Maybe I had misunderstood the Ariel. Her use of English was still rather flimsy. Yeah, that was probably it. I hoped, at least. I was distracted all the next day by this, barely paying attention to the ride. Not that it mattered, it was little different from the previous day's trek, and the following one would closely mirror it as well. Is it possible to do a travel montage with audio? Cross-fading scenes of us riding together as the sun rises and falls behind us? No? Okay, well, in that case, I'm gonna fast forward again, as I told you I would, to the last night and the last camp we made before reaching the coast. As before, the unsaddled manticores grazed for a while, then lay down to form a triangle around us and the fire we'd built. It was still early in the night, and we'd only just finished eating. I leaned against my husband, his arm around me, as we mused about our podcast.
There was usually a year between seasons, but all of this is happening just after the events of the last one.
Well, it probably won't even come out until next year, right? I mean, if at all.
Yeah, we'd somehow have to get all these recordings back to Earth, and even if we're successful on this quest, I really doubt Bruce is gonna let us use the orb. Kind of feels like a waste to even be recording.
You still should, though, just in case.
But even if by some miracle we can get the audio to Sylvia, I'm not sure what she'll do with it.
She'll release it as the podcast, of course.
Sure, but what is this podcast now? It doesn't even feel like a podcast anymore, let alone the same one as before.
How do you mean?
We used to be an investigative show, delving into shadowy mysteries and solving them.
Is that not what we're doing out here?
I guess it just...
It feels different.
Yeah.
Well, it is different. Better.
You think people will enjoy this more? Going from Circle City to Planet Camelot?
Yeah, of course. It doesn't have to be exactly like it was before. I mean, who cares if we're not out here fighting monsters anymore?
Ready your weapons.
May hissed this command as she lifted her spear. Flo was already clenching hers, and Remy took up his mace and I drew my saber. Looking to my husband, I saw him kneel to disconnect a pair of spikes that had been attached vertically to the outer part of his greaves, what I had assumed part of the armor. Surprised, I watched as he reattached these spikes to his gauntlets. Back at the castle, I had thought the arm and leg armor to be their own pairs, but they had actually been designed as a 4-piece set. The spikes were carried discreetly on the greaves during travel, but transplanted to the gauntlets in times of battle. Now Joseph had a couple of lengthy barbs extending from either forearm, ready to skewer anything foolish enough to come within his lengthened reach. Instinctively, we all turned our backs to the fire, forming a circle around it. The nervously shifting manticores were largely blocking our view of nothing. The darkness beyond our firelight was unbroken. I would discover later that same night that our animals have almost total night vision, so they saw what was coming and would also serve as our first defense against whatever it was. Then, through gaps between our mounts, we began to see the glow of eyes. One pair here, another there, still another and another. This was not the bioluminescence of the Strangels. No, this was eyeshine, a reflection of the firelight. I tried to count the pairs, but couldn't. I didn't know what these creatures were, just that they were many.
It's a pack. Maevalesse, what kind of beasts are...
They bound into our midst, vaulting the manticores as if the enormous animals were barely hurdles at all. They crashed into our group, even into our fire, slashing and slathering, utterly berserk. As I swung and stabbed in my own defense, all I could discern were tall, rangy, humanoid beasts with coats of matted gray fur. From the corner of my eye, I saw the manticores go on the attack. As one of the beasts tried to jump over him, Jellybean sprang up and caught it from the air just as he had my apple. He brought the thing down to the ground, chewing the life from it. Lomray and Guts, meanwhile, took the fight into the darkness to meet and stop the rest of the coming horde. This kept the creatures from overwhelming my companions and I, buying us time to repel the surprise attack. And we did. This was not the Strangels' first fight, and as for Joseph and I, it sure as heck wasn't ours either.
Is that all of them?
The manticores.
Coming back. There.
May, what are these things?
They look like wolves.
May?
I do not know.
What do you mean you don't know? How can you not know?
We have never seen creatures like this before. They do not belong to our world.
They belong to ours, Lindsay.
What? What is happening to them?
The dead monsters began to rot as if in time lapse. They shrunk and split open. May went to the nearest beast and conducted an impromptu necropsy, wedging her spear into the crack that had formed in its chest cavity and prying it wide. She called for light. Flo turned to the scattered remains of our disrupted fire, a flaming log of which she stabbed with her spear. She now had a makeshift torch. I noticed that there was no blood on her weapon. I didn't know it then, but Flo had not fought back against the beasts. She had frozen up. I could hardly blame her. The beasts were horrifying, and we hadn't seen the half of it yet. We all followed Flo and her torch, crowding around our leader and the carcass. The firelight illuminated an appalling, an impossible sight. Inside, the creature was...
It's a man. A human. One of the Atlanteans?
He's molting.
What?
That's how they transform back and forth. They grow the beastly shell and then shed it once they're done. In death, the process is automatic.
How could you possibly know that?
I read about this. This is transmogrification. These are lycanthropes.
Werewolves?
Yes.
This is the work of the Grimalkin.
If she can turn herself into a cat, I guess it makes sense that she can turn these guys into dogs.
So they picked up our scent.
They were not tracking us. They came from up ahead, from the way we are going.
They were sent from the Lost Isles?
Sent to kill us before we got there.
But that means... No, that can't be right. That means the witch knows we're coming for her.
Do good. Fight evil. Repeat. I'm Lindsay Leck, and this is the Endless Elsewhere podcast.